Yeah, so it's my pleasure to record this little audio interview with Dr. Anne Rüggemeier from Albert-Ludwigs-Universität in Freiburg. And Anne gave a very interesting presentation on May 19th in the Uses of Literature group, which we recorded, but then we could not upload this recording for copyright issues. So Anna, I'm super grateful that you agreed to re-record a very short audio version, which
You're welcome.
a summary of your main points in the form of an interview. So welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this interview, to have something for people who couldn't join us.
Yes, yeah.
My pleasure.
So let's get right into it. You work as a postdoc in the ERC-funded project Lists in Literature and Culture. And you're also an associated member of the research training group Factual and Fictional Narration. So clearly your interests are in lists, are in narratives, and particularly in illness narratives and graphic illness narratives. And I want to focus on lists for the first part. And lists are, of course, something that we all use every day. So we make grocery lists, we make to-do lists. But I wonder, can you tell us a little bit more about the literary aesthetics of lists and how they relate to questions of usability in literary narratives?
Well, I mean, lists are a literary constant. And when Eva von Konzen, the principal investigator of this ERC Starting Ground project I work in, when she started the project, I think she felt that readers often skip them. It made her suspicious, and she wanted to start a project especially dedicated to lists in literature, I think. Of course, lists experience a new cultural prominence right now, as they are one of the typical small and reduced forms of communication that are used and that shape contemporary media culture, and especially digital culture. At the same time, lists can be found at the beginning of writing, as they served as a basic means of recording and accounting. The literary aesthetics of the list are diverse and highly dependent on the context they are set in. For example, lists can be used to present something that is immensely large and unknowable. Umberto Eco called this the topos of ineffability. Something is that enormous that the seeming enumeration of individual items just expresses the impossibility of describing the whole thing. An example could be St. John's Apocalypse, where the narrator, after describing his most bizarre visions, then summarizes, "After this, I saw a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations and tribes and people and tongues." So here the sheer effect of the listing is that readers are triggered to imagine that what cannot be listed. But lists can also have an effect of immersion. So if you think of the dense descriptions in Victorian novels, of course, these descriptions, especially in Dickens, can also have a comic effect and sometimes also poetic or lyrical effect. But lists can intensify moods and create visual impressions. They can, to use one of Rita Felsky's terms for the modes of textual engagement, enchant by their repetitive rhythms and patterns. For example, when Dickens describes the fog in this first passage of Bleak House, like fog is everywhere, fog is up the river, fog is down the river, fog on the Essex marches, fog lying out on the yards, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, and so on. So it draws pictures, it creates atmospheres. And maybe this is also the effect achieved in children's books and nursery rhymes that do not want to convey a story, but rather evoke sensations, usually pleasure and delight in the linguistic patterns and sounds of language, words and sounds. Yes, and lists have an affinity to catalogs and order. This is why in literature, lists are the typical linguistic means to describe collections. For example, in Dorian Gray in chapter 11, just in the middle of the book, the progress of narrative action is slowed down by the listed description of beautiful and ugly things that Dorian collects or studies. And these lists of perfumes, musical instruments, jewelry, and ancient embroidery stage a tension between descriptive pause and narration. But this is not pure description, but the lists become a means to characterize Dorian. So the lists simultaneously represent his taste and cultivation, while they also, through their simple enumeration, create an impression of his moral and psychic degeneration. So, lists in literature can trigger contradictory readings. lists can also disturb because they leave us alone with impressions and suggestions, but they do not tell us what to make of a specific information. As usually the narrative voice gets rid of its commentary function that usually, at least in Victorian novels, guides us in our reading process. And lists also feature prominently in texts that express excess and abundancy. This listing of abundancy is often part and parcel or an invitation to make fun of this endless human attempt to order, to categorize, and to create taxonomies, and eventually to measure the world, to claim knowledge of the world. And finally, lists are also connected to modernism's experiments with linguistic and formal experimentation, as we find them, for example, in James Joyce. And this experiential character is even stronger in the works of the Oulipo group, especially in the lists of Perec, when he sits down at a place in Paris and just notes down everything he sees. And of course, also in the works of Beckett, where the list serves as a tool to highlight the self-referentiality of language and the absurdity of existence. So all in all, it makes most sense to approach the list in terms of its affordances, its diverse potentialities. Though it is remarkably stable over time, it is also extremely adaptable to historical and literary contexts, I suggest.
That's so fascinating. And in your research specifically, you look at the use of lists in illness narratives, and particularly in graphic novels. Could you describe how the writers of these texts use lists in their representations of illness? And would you say that the uses of these lists are different from the uses that you just mentioned?
Yes, I think they are a bit different and also a bit more specific, because this is a very specific context. And still the uses of lists in these texts are again diverse. So first, the lists in my corpus very often imitate and represent the typical practical lists that are used in everyday medical practice. I mean, you know them. You enter a hospital or a surgery, and the first thing they do with you is that they provide you with a questionnaire with lists of questions, including boxes to be ticked off or lines where you can list your allergies, etc. So these checklists or medical history forms take on the status of an admission ticket. Before you can see a doctor, first thing to do is go through this list of questions and answer them. And when you finally see a doctor and you start to talk, what actually happens is that, again, your conversation will usually be guided by this list. Of course, this is due to the situation that medicine and care for the patient is demanding, I think, and lists serve to avoid mistakes and also to be time efficient. So this is reflected in memoirs such as Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto, where the famous surgeon kind of argues, well, we are doctors, we are human, we can fail, so let us use checklists. However, this checklist culture can lead to an objectification of the patient, and this experience is represented in, for example, the lists as they feature in Brian Fay's graphic memoirs, Cancer. I think that the inclusion of these practical lists from the clinical everyday trigger recognition. So we as patients and as relatives of ill persons, we know these lists, we recognize them. The form of the list creates common ground. We may also have touched this kind of document, or we have also gone through these questionnaires. We maybe have also felt that the answers offered to be ticked off do not quite fit our situation. So the list, the practical everyday tool, plays an important role in medicine, clinical contexts, and in the experience of being ill. And checklists, lists of medication and lists of side effects, lists of symptoms and lists of therapeutic measures are important tools in this everyday life of being ill. But actually, however, in our everyday, we may usually not really pay attention to them. But this is different when we find them included in a work of art suddenly. And of course, this depends on how artists, writers, and cartoonists use the list and how they are included and contextualized and framed and formed. We see them in a different light. And here I'm adapted to read Tucholsky's remark on the perplexing and paradoxical nature of recognition, when she states that recognition is not repetition. It denotes not just the previously known, but the becoming known, something that may have been sensed in a vague, diffuse, or semi-conscious way now takes on a distinct shape, is amplified, heightened, or made newly visible. And of course, this expression newly visible is very important for my context as I deal with graphic novels, a medium that uses visual and verbal language. And the way in which graphic illness narratives take the practical lists, the documents, and include them as photographs or as redrawn images into their comic books does something to the authority of the list. It questions the sources and the procedures that ultimately took part in the list's creation. While lists as documents are often just accepted as given facts and given procedures, the handmade redrawing, so the remediation of these documents, questions their status as given fact. As a consequence, I would argue that the processes of assessment, evaluation, and categorization that work with and are based on lists are suddenly not just illuminated and kind of questioned, but they also become part of the creative process, which implies the notion of contestation and possible change, I think. Well, and as lists feature prominently in everyday life, and comics as an originally countercultural genre is predestined for representations of the everyday, we also find diverse other forms of practical lists, such as phone logs, shopping lists, to-do lists, and inventories. With each of them needs to be explored and analyzed specifically in the context of these illness texts, and I cannot go into detail here. Sometimes, however, they work as means of authentication, sometimes as means of focalization, sometimes just as a means to create alternative facts. And yet, in general, it is noteworthy that the pragmatic lists, the pragmatic does not exclude the poetic. So very often they are poetic lists at the same time. So when you start to work on lists, you start to see lists everywhere, and questions come up such as, what is the difference between items named and items drawn? So lists belong to the realm of the practical, the documentary, management, administration, but the lists also belong to the realm of the poetic, where it asks us to constantly negotiate the relationship between individual word and contextual meaning, the episodic and the narrative, the sound and the rhythm, and the isolated impression and the construction of relational meaning. Yes, this is how I would answer to this.
This is so fascinating. I think it's just brilliant how you describe kind of the links between these everyday practices that we associate with the list, and then also, the literary and aesthetic elements that are part of the list and list making, and how they are connected through reading. So that's, well, I'm completely fascinated. Thank you so much for giving this very brief insight into your research.
Yes, you're very, very welcome. I'm happy to share my work. Thank you for your questions that helped me to think it through.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Well, if our listeners are interested in learning more about your research, they can check out two journal articles that you published last year in 2019 in the journal AB Autobiography Studies. Well, thank you so much, Anna, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, same for me. Goodbye. Thank you, Anita.